It had been years since my parents split. I still remember that night, the shouting from downstairs, the cold silence that followed. Mom had caught Dad cheating. The divorce came fast, and Mom moved out shortly after, leaving me in a house that felt emptier by the day. Dad didn't stick around long either. His work kept him traveling, but even when he was home, he was hardly present. That left me with Emily, my stepmom, who by all accounts should have left my dad years ago, but she didn't. Emily was different. At 63, she had an elegance about her that women half her age couldn't match. Beautiful in a way that wasn't loud or obvious. She carried herself with this quiet confidence that pulled people in, even me. I didn't know when my feelings for her had started to change. Maybe it was during those long summer evenings we spent together after Dad left for another work trip. We were in the same house, living parallel lives, but slowly, those lines started to blur. She'd make dinner, and I'd join her in the kitchen. She'd sit out on the porch, and I'd follow, talking about everything and nothing as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was easy to talk to her, easier than anyone I'd ever known. This summer, though, something shifted. I couldn't stop noticing the way she smiled at me, the way her laughter made my chest tighten. And then there was the way she looked. How stunning she still was, even in her 60s. It wasn't just that she was attractive, she was magnetic. And the more time I spent around her, the more I found myself thinking about her in ways I knew I shouldn't. One evening, we were sitting together in the living room. The heat of the day had finally lifted, and the windows were open, letting in the warm summer breeze. She was on the couch, a book in her hands, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. I sat across from her, pretending to be interested in whatever was on TV. "You've been quiet lately," she said without looking up from her book. Her voice had that softness to it, like she knew I was carrying something, but didn't want to push. I swallowed, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't wrong. I had been quiet. I didn't know how to talk to her about what I was feeling. How could I? She was my stepmom. She'd been in my life for as long as I could remember. These weren't thoughts I was supposed to have. "I guess I've just had a lot on my mind," I said, avoiding her gaze. She finally looked up, her eyes locking onto mine. "Anything you want to talk about?" I shook my head. No, there was nothing I could say, not out loud at least. But she kept looking at me, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air heavier. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the tension that was building between us. I couldn't help but notice her bosom, her voluptuous figure, even more noticeable in her tight blouse. I so wanted to touch her. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she said, her voice gentler now. She smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my heart race. It was the kind of smile that made me wonder if she already knew. I nodded, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood up, mumbling something about needing some air before heading outside. As I stepped into the yard, the cool breeze hit my skin, but it did little to calm me down. I leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the stars. My mind was racing, torn between what I knew was right and this pull I felt toward her. I was confused by how I could feel so drawn to someone I wasn't supposed to, someone my father had brought into my life. But as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't stop thinking about her. She made me feel something in my body, an urge to hold her tight or be held tightly by her. But she was my stepmom, and no matter how charming or beautiful she was, I couldn't let myself go there. One day, I was sitting in the backyard staring out at the lake. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water. But all I could think about was how messed up everything had become. Claire had left about an hour ago. It wasn't our first fight, but it felt like it might be our last. She was 19, impulsive, and still figuring herself out. While I wasn't exactly sure where I stood either. But I knew enough to realize that we were on different wavelengths. She wanted excitement, spontaneity, things that didn't seem to matter to me anymore. "I don't get you, Jake," she had said, her voice full of frustration. "One minute you're all over me, and the next, it's like I don't even exist." I didn't know how to explain it to her. I wanted to care the way she wanted me to, but everything felt wrong. There was no depth between us. It was all surface level, and every time I tried to connect with her emotionally, she'd brush it off, eager to move on to the next thrill. It wasn't her fault, I reminded myself. She was just young. But that was the problem, wasn't it? She was inexperienced emotionally and physically, and it was starting to show. Her immaturity made it harder for me to feel anything meaningful. She didn't understand what I needed, and truth be told, I didn't even know how to tell her. I was upset with myself too. I had been distant more than I wanted to admit, and I knew why. It wasn't fair to her, not when my mind kept drifting back to Emily, my stepmom. Sitting there, I couldn't stop the memories from flooding in, the way Emily made me feel, how she seemed to understand things without me having to say a word. There was something about her calmness, her maturity, her ability to be present without needing constant attention or validation. She had a way of making everything feel grounded, and that was what I craved. Claire didn't give me that. She was all energy and unpredictability, a whirlwind that never stopped. I had thought her wildness would be exciting, but now I just felt exhausted and guilty. Guilty because every time we fought, I realized more and more that it wasn't Claire I wanted to be with, it was Emily. Claire and I would end up in a fight after getting physically close. She would want that constant pleasure without giving the same to me. It wouldn't be wrong to say that she was selfish in bed, and I wasn't very pleased with that. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes as the breeze picked up. Emily was inside, probably reading or fixing something in the kitchen. Dad was away again, traveling for work like he always did. That left the two of us alone most of the time. And the more time I spent with her, the harder it became to ignore what was happening. I had a girlfriend. I should have been focused on that, but here I was, thinking about my 63-year-old stepmother instead. Emily wasn't like Claire. She wasn't impulsive or reckless. She had lived a life, seen things, done things that I couldn't even begin to imagine. That experience, that wisdom, it drew me in. With her, I didn't feel like I had to pretend. I didn't have to perform or impress. She made me feel understood in a way Claire never could. But it wasn't just about understanding. It was more than that. I was attracted to her too, and that scared me. I couldn't explain it even to myself. She was my dad's wife. The thought alone should have made me feel sick, but it didn't. Instead, it left me wanting more. It became even more complicated that day. The rain had started out of nowhere, the sky opening up and pouring down in sheets. I stood by the window watching it hammer against the glass, the sound rhythmic and oddly calming. Dad had left earlier that day, off on another business trip, leaving me alone with the house to myself, or so I thought. The front door swung open, and I heard the rush of footsteps before I saw her. Emily stepped into the hallway soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, droplets of water sliding down her neck. She cursed under her breath, shaking off her raincoat, and I watched from the corner of the living room, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't even realized she'd gone out, but now she was back, drenched from head to toe, her clothes clinging to her in ways I couldn't ignore. She was all tight, and I could see that through her blouse, caught in the storm. She said, offering me a sheepish smile as she pushed the wet strands of hair out of her face. Wasn't expecting it to rain this hard. I nodded, unable to find my voice for a moment. My eyes followed her as she kicked off her shoes and walked into the kitchen, her wet clothes sticking to her skin. I tried not to stare, but it was impossible not to. The way her shirt clung to her body, the curves of her figure outlined against the damp fabric. It was too much. "You must be starving," she called out, breaking my train of thought. "How about I make us something to eat? I'll throw these clothes in the dryer first." I muttered something like, "Yeah, sure," though I wasn't entirely sure what I had agreed to. My heart was racing, and I felt heat creeping up my neck. She disappeared upstairs to change, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I sat down at the dining table, trying to shake the image of her out of my mind, but it lingered. It wasn't the first time I had noticed her like that, But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the rain or the fact that we were alone, but the tension I'd been feeling for weeks now seemed to settle between us like a fog. A few minutes later, she came back down, dressed in a dry pair of leggings and a loose shirt. It should have made things easier, but it didn't. She still looked incredible, her damp hair now pulled into a loose bun, her skin still glowing from the rain. She moved around the kitchen with ease, pulling ingredients out of the fridge and setting them on the counter. I watched her every move, the way her hips swayed as she moved from the stove to the sink, the soft hum of a song I didn't recognize escaping her lips. It was like she wasn't even trying, yet she had my full attention. "Pasta okay?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder at me. "Yeah, that's fine," I managed to say, my voice a little too tight. I shifted in my chair, trying to focus on anything but her. But the more I tried not to look, the harder it became to tear my eyes away. She was so different from anyone I'd ever been with, so composed, so sure of herself. Even in the simplest of tasks like cooking dinner, she exuded this effortless grace. She caught me staring at one point, and for a second, I thought she might say something. But instead, she just smiled, that soft, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Rain's really coming down," she said, breaking the silence as she stirred the pot on the stove. "Looks like it's going to last all night." I nodded, swallowing hard. My mouth felt dry, and my thoughts were a tangled mess. What was I doing? Why couldn't I stop thinking about her like this? She set the plates on the table and sat across from me. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the room, but I could barely taste the food. My mind was too wrapped up in her, how close she was, how easy it would be to reach out and touch her hand. We ate in silence for a while, the sound of the rain filling the space between us. I wanted to say something to break the tension that hung in the air, but I didn't know how. She seemed so at ease, as if nothing unusual was happening, but for me, every second that passed felt like the air was getting thicker, like I was being pulled into something I wasn't ready for. After dinner, she stood up to clear the plates, and I couldn't help myself. My eyes followed her every movement again. The way her shirt lifted slightly as she reached for the dishes, revealing a sliver of skin just above her waistband. "Thanks for keeping me company tonight," she said softly, her voice breaking through my thoughts. She turned to look at me, her eyes lingering a little longer than they should have. "Anytime," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. As she walked past me to put the plates in the sink, her hand brushed against my shoulder, and I felt a jolt, like a spark shooting through me. She didn't say anything, didn't even pause, but I knew she felt it too. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside, everything had changed. As I sat there, the rain still hammering down outside, my mind drifted to Claire. I couldn't help it. She was my girlfriend. At least I was supposed to think of her that way. But as I sat in the same room with Emily, something gnawed at me. There was never a spark with Claire, not like this. Sure, Claire was sweet, fun even. She was always so full of energy, eager to try new things, always pulling me into some impulsive adventure. But there was something missing between us, something I couldn't quite name. At first, I had convinced myself it was just a phase, that we needed more time to figure each other out. But sitting here, feeling this overwhelming pull toward Emily, I realized it wasn't about time. It was about connection, or the lack of it. I wanted to get closer to her. I wanted to feel that energy again, the way my heart raced when she smiled at me, the way my skin tingled when her hand brushed against mine, even by accident. With her, I felt alive, more aware of myself than I ever did with Claire. I glanced over at Emily as she stood at the sink, her back to me, and felt a tightness in my chest. I couldn't deny it anymore. The spark I had been searching for, the one I never found with Claire, was here, in this house, in this moment, and it wasn't going away. I wanted her. I wanted to get closer to her, closer than I ever thought possible. But what scared me most was that I didn't know how to stop. I wanted a pack of cigarettes. I knew it would be in my father's room. I went inside, and while I was searching the drawers, I found a set of letters. The letters were from Emily to my father. They were all seductive and passionate. She explained to him every inch of her body and how her body missed his touch. She described in words how even thinking about him made her feel something down there. The letters were from the time when my parents were married, and that was the empirical evidence of my father cheating on my mother. Maybe this was how she caught him. There was a mixed feeling. I was enraged as well as turned on. I felt bad for my mother, but imagining Emily, along with the description, made me want to get pleasure. I could feel it there. I had never felt such a confusing mix of emotions before. Anger, desire, frustration, all of it boiled inside me as I sat in my room thinking about my father. He deserved to feel the same betrayal he had caused years ago when he cheated on my mother. I couldn't help but wonder what it would feel like for him to face the same pain. My thoughts drifted to Emily. She was always there in the back of my mind, her beauty and grace consuming me in ways I couldn't control. I felt an overwhelming need to be closer to her, to feel that same intensity between us that I sensed every time she looked at me. Lost in those thoughts, I didn't even notice when she entered the room. When I finally saw her, she was standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on me. She had caught me off guard, but something in her expression made me freeze. It wasn't shock or judgment. No, it was something else. Something that made me feel like she understood. Her gaze lingered, and instead of pulling away in embarrassment, I stayed where I was. She stepped forward, and I could feel the tension rise. Her hand reached for mine, and the touch sent a wave of emotion through me. It was like a silent acknowledgement, as if she knew what was going on in my mind without me having to say a word. The connection between us, something unspoken, felt stronger in that moment than ever before. I reached for her, my hands trembling slightly as I touched her arm. She didn't pull away. In fact, she stepped closer. There was no hesitation. It felt natural, like something we had both been avoiding but knew was inevitable. Her soft sigh filled the room as our hands intertwined. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, a shared understanding of the complicated emotions that had been building between us for months. We didn't speak, but every movement, every touch, seemed to convey something words couldn't express. We were close, closer than we had ever been. And I was overwhelmed by the mixture of desire and anger coursing through me. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about feeling seen, feeling wanted, and knowing that someone understood me on a level that no one else did. Emily's touch was gentle, but it held a weight of experience, a knowing that made me feel both safe and completely out of control at the same time. The boundaries between us blurred, and I realized I had wanted this for a long time, even if I hadn't admitted it to myself. Then the door slammed open. The storm outside was loud, but it couldn't drown out the fury in my father's eyes as he stood in the doorway, the thunder rumbling in the distance, as if echoing his rage.